Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. In an abandoned farmhouse in central Italy, a young man searched closets for something to wear. He wasn't going to a fancy ball or a party. Instead, he was walking into a war zone. The boom of artillery could be heard around him as the Allies and Germans traded shots. Amid the thundering of the shells, the man found exactly what he needed. Old clothes, once worn by a farmer who had long since abandoned his home in the face of war. It would be the perfect disguise. He got dressed, gathered some tools, and went outside. Observers saw a farmer weeding his field, completely ignoring the warring parties. He slowly inched his way along and then stopped to tie his shoes. All of this was done in the open field in front of the Germans, who were shocked by the audacity of this farmer who seemed to care little for his dangerous surroundings. But this was no farmer, and he was not tying his shoes. And his covert efforts that day earned him a medal for his act of bravery. I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X. Today I share the story of the most decorated soldier of the legendary Devil's Brigade, Tommy Prince. Long before Tommy Prince was born, his great-grandfather, Chief Peguis, was making his mark in history. He was the leader of the Saulteaux people, and in the 1790s, when settlers encroached into First Nation lands along the eastern shores of Lake Superior, he led his people west. They spent months walking between the lake and the Canadian Shield until they arrived in present-day Manitoba to settle near the southern shores of Lake Winnipeg. Unfortunately, traveling 1,000 kilometers from their ancestral home wasn't enough because by the 1810s, the Selkirk settlers had arrived in the Red River Valley. However, Chief Peguis didn't greet them as enemies. He saw these new arrivals struggling to survive, and Peguis and his people kept them fed, warm, and alive. After everything he did for his people and his settlers, he gave his family a name that was better fitting for his lineage. Peguis became Prince. Upon his father's death in 1864, his son Henry Prince became chief. During the Red River Resistance of 1869-70, he gave shelter to English-speaking settlers who worried about attacks from the Métis. Henry Prince then led a delegation to speak with Manitoba Lieutenant Governor Adams George Archibald to secure the future of his people. He was successful, and on August 3, 1871, Treaty 1 was signed to cede the territory to the Crown in return for supplies, food, and more. While Henry Prince negotiated in good faith, government officials did not and failed to live up to their agreement. In 1877, the chief complained to the Minister of Interior, David Mills, and soon after, the government tried to remove Henry from his position. Despite their efforts, Henry served as chief until the day he died on June 7, 1899. His son, also named Henry, became the next chief of the Saulteaux. He would go on to meet Arabella, an Ojibwe woman, and the two got married. Time passed, and while Canada waged war overseas, a young man who was about to become a legend was born on October 25, 1915. His name? Tommy George Prince. Henry Prince taught his son everything he knew. By the time Tommy was a young man, Henry was teaching him to be an expert marksman by giving him 5 bullets to shoot through a target the size of a playing card that was 100 meters away. Before he was 10 years old, Tommy was a crack shot. However, like so many other young Indigenous children, Tommy was ripped from his family and put into a residential school by the government. And while we know very little about his experiences, we do know that for thousands of other children, residential schools were a place of abuse and cultural genocide. By the time he was in the 8th grade, Tommy left the school and joined the Royal Canadian Army Cadets. Almost immediately, he felt as though he had discovered his true calling. He said, "As soon as I put my uniform on, I felt like a better man. I even tried to wear it to class." He remained with the cadets throughout his teens and hoped to complete school, then study law. The Great Depression and tough economic times put a stop to that dream. Tommy instead became a manual laborer to provide for the family. But then, on September 10, 1939, Canada declared war on Germany and officially entered the Second World War. Immediately, Tommy wanted to serve. He was an excellent marksman in the prime of his life and in perfect health. He was turned down. He repeatedly tried to enlist, and each time he was refused. Systemic racism and discrimination in the Canadian Army kept him from joining. But that didn't stop Tommy, and he continued to put his name forward. Finally, in June 1940, his application was accepted. Soldiers were needed in Europe, and that outweighed the racism. Tommy said he wanted to prove that, quote, "an Indian was as good as any white man." Shortly after he finally enlisted, Tommy was on his way to England as a member of the Royal Canadian Engineers. As a sapper, he showed his value and was quickly promoted to Lance Corporal in February 1941. But Tommy hated what he considered to be busy work. He was either sitting behind a desk or operating a piece of machinery. He had much more to give. And he was about to get his chance. By 1942, the war had dragged on for 3 years, and the Allies were looking for a way to break through the impenetrable fortress controlled by the Germans. To make headway, they would need an innovative war strategy, and Geoffrey Pike had one. In 1939, just prior to the war, the controversial Englishman had sent volunteers into Germany to interview citizens to find out what they truly thought of the Nazi regime. His volunteers posed as golfers on a tour. They went to Frankfurt, got their intel, and left a week before the war started. Now, 3 years later, he had the idea of creating a small and elite commando unit. One that could land anywhere in Europe by sea or air and be able to sabotage oil fields and hydroelectric plants. His main target was Norway, where the production of heavy water was aiding the Germans in their quest to build an atomic bomb. Pike proposed his special force parachute into the Norwegian mountains to establish a covert base. And in March 1942, he took his idea to Lord Louis Mountbatten, chief of the Combined Operations Headquarters, who liked the idea but didn't want British forces involved. Instead, it would be an American and Canadian joint effort. In July 1942, the Canadian Minister of National Defence, James Townsend, approved the reassignment of 697 men for Project Plough. Due to the highly secretive nature of the force, the official story was the men were training as part of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Tommy, however, heard through the grapevine that this special force was being assembled, and he wanted in. That unit would become one of the most successful military units in war history, and they would be known as the Devil's Brigade. Tommy was exactly the type of soldier the commanders of this new and specialized force were looking for. He was single, and thanks to his upbringing, he was more than capable outdoors. Tommy and the new recruits were trained to use explosives, amphibious warfare, mountain climbing, skiing, hand-to-hand combat, and other stealth tactics. They trained with Allied weapons and German weapons. They were to be flexible, think on their feet, while always being focused on the mission at hand. And by the end of their training, the Devil's Brigade were the best of the best and ready to go into Norway. But that didn't happen because Norwegian commandos had already destroyed the German deuterium plants. Military leaders first offered the Devil's Brigade services to Alaska's Aleutian Islands in case of a Japanese attack. But then they were sent to Italy in November 1943 to aid in the Allied push to Rome. Their mission was deemed impossible. Larger Allied forces had failed to assault enemy positions to penetrate German lines, so now it would be up to the Devil's Brigade. Initially, they were posted near Naples to raid enemy territory, and Tommy Prince quickly set himself apart from the rest. He wore Ojibwe moccasins to silently penetrate enemy lines during the night without a sound. If he had to, he would kill a guard, but mostly he walked among the sleeping Germans. He would steal their boots and leave messages for them to discover the next day. It was psychological warfare, and Tommy was very good at it. Enemy soldiers would wake up to knowing their enemy had been standing next to them while they slept. And one man who noticed the unique skills of Tommy Prince was Lieutenant Colonel Tom Gilday, the commander of the battalion. And soon, he would have the perfect mission just for him. In late 1944, Montmajoux and Mont La Defensa became critical to the Allies in their Italy campaign. Situated along the Magnano Gap, Mont La Defensa was considered a gatepost key to their march to Rome. It was well defended by the Germans, and British and American forces were in a stalemate. Every attempt to take it failed. Enter the Devil's Brigade. It would be the unit's first combat action in Italy, and to succeed, the force would have to scale the mountain and attack the Germans directly on top. And from December 3rd to December 9th, 1943, the Devil's Brigade went to work. Their hard-fought battle was an overwhelming success and showed how good they were. But they couldn't rest on their laurels. They still needed to take Montmajoux. The Germans had artillery and machine gun encampments arranged in layers along the steep slopes of the mountain. Any attempt at an attack would alert them, and they would unload a tremendous firepower on whoever tried. So, Lieutenant Colonel Gilday turned to his secret weapon, Tommy Prince. He was assigned to lead a patrol. His mission was to create a pathway for an attack. To be successful, he had to do it without making a sound. And partway up the mountain, Tommy stopped his patrol. He would go on the rest of the way alone, and his compatriots watched him move like a shadow in the night. Death greeted every German on his path that night as he took out every gunner and soldier in total silence. He completed his mission without raising a single alarm. By the break of dawn, every German gun pit along the route was neutralized. Only the ones on the top of the mountain remained, and they had no idea that the Devil's Brigade were climbing the mountain in silence. Within hours, they ambushed, and the mountain was in Allied hands. But the Germans quickly mounted a counterattack, and over the next few days, Prince and the Devil's Brigade fought hard to keep that mountain. And while they held the mountain, it came at a cost. The force was reduced to only 400 men. Tommy Prince deserved a medal for what he had done in that mission. You could even argue he deserved the highest honor in the British Empire, the Victoria Cross. But he received no citation, no medal. His mission was classified, and honors such as medals would have compromised the Devil's Brigade, and that was okay, because they weren't done yet. As the Allies gained ground in Italy, the Devil's Brigade was sent to Anzio. The Allies were heavily under attack and in an area just over 80 kilometers from Rome. By this point, the Devil's Brigade had seen its ranks replenished to 1,200 men, and their mission was to hold several kilometers of ground against an entire German division of several thousand men. In the face of that much manpower, Lieutenant Colonel Gilday gave Tommy his mission. He was to go into enemy territory to report the location of their assembly points. Once again, Tommy left like a shadow, and the Devil's Brigade waited and waited. When Prince didn't return the following day, Gilday believed he was dead. He didn't return the next day either. But 2 nights later, Tommy finally emerged from the shadows. He said he had entered a deserted farmhouse near the Germans, and soon after they had entered the house. Tommy evaded them as he made his way into the attic, where he hid for an entire day while the Germans searched the house and slept. They had no idea that one of the war's deadliest soldiers was directly above them. And when they left, Tommy returned to Allied territory to report on his mission. The next day, Gilday sent Tommy back to the farmhouse with telephone wire to keep him in contact with his unit. Once again, Tommy entered enemy territory while hauling and laying down 1 kilometer of wire and set up a base only 200 meters from the Germans to report back to his commanders. The day after he arrived, the Germans and the Allies opened fire on each other, and one of the bombs landed near his farmhouse and severed the communication wire. And that is when Tommy sprang into action. He found some clothes, grabbed a few tools, and went outside disguised as a farmer. And while he pretended to weed his crops, he searched for the damaged wire. When he found it, Tommy knelt down and pretended to tie his shoes and quickly fix the wire. Then, he stood up, shook his fist at the Germans and the Allies, and went back into the house like a disgruntled farmer. Once safely inside, he continued to report back. And when he returned 3 days later, Gilday asked him about the farmer they had seen, and in response, Tommy simply smiled and said it was him. Thanks to his efforts, the German artillery locations were destroyed, and Tommy was awarded the military medal for his bravery. Throughout his missions in Anzio, Tommy went into German territory while wearing his moccasins, and he was like a ghost to the enemy. Each time he left them notes and stole their boots. The Germans called this unknown entity Geist, or Teufel, meaning ghost and devil. The Devil's Brigade and Tommy Prince did their part, and on June 4th, 1944, the Allies liberated Rome. And with their mission complete, they were on to their next target. And this time, they would be heading to France. The Allies had made progress following D-Day on June 6, 1944. They had pushed into France in the Battle of Normandy in the north and were on their way to liberating the country. To help their efforts, the Devil's Brigade entered southern France, and once again, Tommy was a thorn on the German side. On September 1st, 1944, Tommy and another soldier entered enemy territory to scout out their positions and make detailed observations, and they were never detected. As they made their way back, they came upon a battle between German and French soldiers. Tommy and his fellow brigadier became snipers behind enemy lines and took out 12 soldiers while wounding several others. Believing they were surrounded, the Germans quickly withdrew. After the brief skirmish, the two brigadiers made their way back to the Allies, and by then they had spent 72 hours without food or sleep. They would get to eat, but no rest, because the Devil's Brigade was needed again. They went back into German territory and used the intel gathered by Tommy's mission to capture or kill 1,000 Germans, and Tommy was awarded the American Silver Star. He was one of only 3 Canadians from the entire Second World War to be awarded both the Military Medal and the American Silver Star. And on February 12, 1945, Tommy was invited to Buckingham Palace. Now, during his reign from 1936 to 1952, King George VI frequently took part in military ceremonies, and the palace often served as a solemn yet proud backdrop for medal presentations. On these occasions, the king would walk the line of assembled servicemen and women, which included soldiers, sailors, airmen, nurses, and civilians, all of whom who had performed acts of bravery or exceptional service. The king would then personally pin decorations, exchange a few words with each recipient, but when he reached Tommy, he shook his hand and didn't move on. The two men spoke for several minutes as the king asked Tommy about his wartime service and his life back in Canada. Stories of his exploits had reached the highest echelon of society, and the king was happy to meet the man behind the legend. The ceremony was both formal and deeply human, as Tommy made his mark on the monarch. And when Victory in Europe Day happened, Tommy was in England and was honorably discharged on June 15, 1945. He left Europe a hero, but it didn't translate across the pond. In Canada, he felt like a second-class citizen once again, and he wasn't going to take that sitting down. Upon his return, he moved to Winnipeg, where he established a successful cleaning service. But being away from his reserve didn't mean he didn't care about his people. A year after the war, Tommy was elected the vice president of the Manitoba Indian Association. The organization then asked him to serve as a chairman for the national delegation that would speak about the Indian Act at a parliamentary committee. First passed in 1876, the Indian Act created a system of reserves, and it dictated how the First Nations could operate and decided who could be considered to have status under the Act. For decades, it gave an immense amount of power to government Indian agents who decided whether a person could leave a reserve and even how much food they received. And Tommy was not a fan of the Indian Act. He believed it made the First Nations dependent on the government and prevented them from reaching their full potential. To prepare for the meeting, he spent several weeks speaking with other First Nations around Canada on his way to Ottawa. At the Parliamentary Committee, he was unable to get the Indian Act abolished, but the members were impressed by Tommy's excellent arguments, which were well organized and researched. Because of this, he was successful pushing for various revisions which removed outdated provisions that had been in place since the 1870s. And if not for his opposition to the Indian Act, it is likely he would have been given a position with the Department of Indian Affairs, but instead he returned home to find his successful cleaning business was destroyed. He had left it in the hands of some friends who turned out to be in it for themselves. They crashed his truck and sold it for scrap. And to make matters worse, they sold his equipment and supplies and stole all the money. Left with nothing, Tommy continued his work for the Manitoba Indian Association while working in the concrete factory to make ends meet. But just as he found a level of comfort, a new war was on the horizon, and Tommy Prince's unique set of skills would be needed once again. The world only saw 5 years of peace because on June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a surprise attack on South Korea by crossing the 38th parallel and started another major war, and many feared this one could go nuclear. Once again, Canada entered the battlefield and sent 26,791 Canadians to serve from 1950 to 1953. They were the third largest force behind only the United States and United Kingdom, and Tommy Prince was one of them. And he had nothing to prove to anyone. He was a highly decorated war hero, and when he re-enlisted in August 1950, he was asked why he was serving again. And Tommy said, "I owed something to my friends who died." In February 1951, he became part of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and once he arrived in Korea, he selected 8 men to train them personally. They were to conduct snatch patrols in enemy territory under the cover of night and were responsible for taking machine guns and eliminating Chinese defenses without suffering a single casualty. But his new commanding officer felt like he was taking too many risks, and slowly Tommy went on fewer patrols. And despite his efforts and official complaints to higher-ups, Tommy's nighttime excursions eventually ended. But during the Battle of Kapyong, Tommy proved his mettle once again. From April 22nd to 27th, 700 Canadians defended Hill 677 against 20,000 Chinese soldiers, and Tommy steadied and gave courage to the young Canadians who were seeing battle for the first time. And even though they were outnumbered 30-1, the Princess Patricia successfully held the hill and prevented a Chinese advance on Seoul. But Tommy's years of service had taken an incredible toll on his body. His knees and his hands often swelled, and he suffered with arthritis. He was hospitalized in May 1951 and sent home to Canada despite his protests to take on administrative duties. But upon his return, the swelling and arthritis improved, and Tommy volunteered to serve once again. By November 1952, he was back with the Princess Patricias in Korea for one last bit of glory. At the Second Battle of the Hook, the 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricias fought against Chinese forces from November 18th to 19th, 1952 to hold a vital sector. And Tommy suffered shrapnel wounds in his legs, but he refused to be evacuated. With his bayonet, he pulled the shrapnel out of his leg and continued to fight until the Canadians retook the post. And once that was done, he carried a wounded soldier to a medical field station where he recovered from his own wounds, but the swelling in his knees returned and he was hospitalized for weeks in 1953. And during that time, the Korean War ended, and now Tommy had to battle readjusting life as a First Nations man in Canada. Tommy Prince had served his country with distinction and bravery. He had cemented his legend during 2 major wars. After his military career was over, Tommy discovered that although he could receive a disability pension for his knees, everything else was off the table. White veterans could receive employment programs, employment support, land purchase support, and income support by applying through the Royal Canadian Legion. But Tommy would get none of that because he wasn't allowed into any legion in Canada. He was a veteran, so he had the right to be there. but he was also First Nations. And since liquor was sold at the premises, no Indigenous veterans could enter a legion under the Indian Act. Every legion enforced this in an effort to exclude First Nations soldiers from participating. And without support from the military and newly married to Verna Sinclair, with whom he would have 5 children, Tommy looked for employment. He found work at an ice cream factory in Winnipeg, and the plant owner knew of his military record and heroics, but Tommy's co-workers did not. And even if they did, it's unlikely they would have even cared. They mocked him. They called him racist names and made his life terrible. Unable to take it anymore, he quit. A few years later, in June 1955, Tommy was walking along the Red River near the Alexander Docks in Winnipeg when he saw a man drowning. Without a second thought, he jumped into the water and pulled him to safety. And as people gathered, Tommy walked away before any media arrived. But one person recognized him and gave Tommy's name to the newspaper. And when the reporter tracked him down and asked why he had risked his life, Tommy said, "I knew how I would have felt if I were in the water unable to swim and someone just stood looking at me, not doing a thing." Over the next few years, Tommy's life somehow worsened. He and his wife divorced in 1964 and their children were put into foster homes. Each child was put into a different home by the government and moved around on a regular basis. This prevented Tommy from keeping in contact with them. He was only able to remain in contact with his daughter, and he visited Beryl every single month at her foster home. But with each passing year, he fell into a deep depression. The battles he fought years earlier manifested into post-traumatic stress disorder, leaving him unable to sleep. And with these inner demons came alcoholism, which led to becoming unhoused. The police knew who Tommy was, and they respected him for his service to his country. And every time they picked him up, he was never charged with vagrancy or public intoxication. They always took him to a Salvation Army facility. Eventually, he made a small room at the Salvation Army his home and did janitorial duties in exchange for shelter. His son, Tommy Prince Jr., offered him a room in his home, but he refused, believing he'd be a burden to his family. And by the 1970s, Tommy was at his lowest point, but once again showed bravery and determination to fight against alcoholism, and Tommy emerged victorious. He also started to speak with the media about his time in the military, but things were still tough, and to make ends meet, he sold his precious war medals. Even when he had next to nothing, though, if Tommy saw someone struggling, he was always eager to help. And every Remembrance Day, he attended ceremonies to honor his comrades who never came home. But life as an Indigenous man in Winnipeg was a risk. And one night in 1976, while walking alone at night, he was attacked by a gang who physically assaulted him and robbed him. Later that year, a young man stabbed him believing he was another First Nations man. And these incidents, along with his years of hard living and war wounds, finally became too much. Tommy Prince, one of the greatest soldiers in Canadian history, arguably the greatest soldier in our history, died on November 25th, 1977 at the age of 62 at Winnipeg's Deer Lodge Centre. When the news of his death spread, over 500 people attended his funeral, and a delegation from the Princess Patricia served as his pallbearers. A group of men from his reserve sang "Death of a Warrior" as his body was lowered into the grave. In attendance that day was the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, several senior officers in the Canadian Army, and the consuls of France, Italy, and the United States. And while his family appreciated the show of respect, they wondered where they all were when he was at his lowest points. And as the years passed, Tommy Prince was forgotten by society once again. But it wouldn't last for long. I never knew Tommy Prince's story or of his heroism. I had heard stories of white men like Billy Bishop, Wap May, and Sir Sam Steele. It wasn't until I grew up and started to do my own reading that I learned of Indigenous heroes like Fred Loft, Francis Pigamagow, and of course, Tommy Prince. And just as I was broadening my own historical views, society was doing the same. And as the 21st century dawned, Canada started to make amends, and today 4 streets bear Tommy Prince's name, along with several buildings and a scholarship. In 2000, his medals came up for auction, and Jim Baird, Tommy's nephew, raised enough money to purchase the medals for $75,000. The bid was backed by many, including the Royal Canadian Legion. Today they sit on display at the Manitoba Museum and are the property of the Prince family. In 2002, the French ambassador to Canada presented his family with a certificate from the government of France in acknowledgement of Tommy's bravery. In 2005, Historica Canada released a heritage minute about him. 5 years later, Manitoba Ojibwe actor Adam Beach was cast to play Tommy Prince in a movie about his life. Beach says it was an honor to be chosen to play a Canadian hero.
And growing up, I've always wanted to find a hero.
Fighting back tears at a press conference in Winnipeg, the 37-year-old actor says he's honored to portray Canada's most decorated Aboriginal soldier. The $11 million flick will be produced by BC's Bay Film Studios, and Beach hopes to turn the story into an inspiration for youth.
Sadly, the film was delayed by reshoots and the studio went bankrupt before it could be released. In 2020, Tommy Prince was declared a person of national historic significance by the Canadian government and became a finalist to have his face on the Canadian $5 banknote. He lost to Terry Fox, and there is no shame in that. Finally, in 2022, Canada Post honored him with a stamp. And while there have been various plays and films and documentaries that featured Tommy Prince, one of the most famous war films of the 1960s wrote him out completely. The 1968 film Devil's Brigade, starring William Holden, is a great movie by most accounts. Based on the 1966 book by Robert Aldman and Colonel George Walton, the movie told the story of the famous brigade and its missions in Europe during the war. Upon its release, the film made $8 million and was one of the highest-grossing films of the year. And unlike a lot of war films based on the exploits of Canadians, this one didn't push us to the side to tell a glorified American story. Looking at You, The Great Escape, and Argo. But that doesn't mean the film was accurate. Many veterans of the Devil's Brigade stated that it was an entertaining movie, but was often steeped in quote-unquote sheer nonsense. But possibly its greatest crime was the complete omission of the most decorated member of the Devil's Brigade, Tommy Prince. There was maybe one reference to him, but like Frodo grabbing Samwise's hand over the magma of Mount Doom, this is quite the reach. In one scene of the Devil's Brigade, an American soldier is playing cards, and he's referred to by the nickname Chief. And that was kind of it. The only reference to Tommy Prince is a terrible one. The man deserved to be the star of the movie. That would have been a fitting tribute to one of the greatest soldiers Canada has ever produced. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at Tommy Prince. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.